Yeah, and it occurs to me that relationship matters for the youth to be able to feel comfortable enough to share and to learn
Right,
from each other and to
right.
flip the script of teacher student top down. This is more of an egalitarian approach and a more there's more equity in what you're describing. And I think there must be a challenge in youth groups that are not racially mixed, right?
Right.
So, what does relationship mean, or churches in general, right? What does relationship mean for predominantly white churches and predominantly Black churches to have these kinds of connections also? And that's a bigger question, and certainly not something we can answer in a one interview or a short soundbite, right? Relationship takes time, but that being open to those kinds of relationships takes some intentional effort and some intentional thought, especially for those of us who are white, to not engage again in that
Yeah,
traditional top-down model, but to really
yeah,
think through what mutuality means and what an honest, authentic relationship can look like. So
yeah,
not
yeah.
easy.
Not easy, but let me speak to, I think you raise an important point that I think we should speak to. I hear this a lot. Well, I'm in a rural community, I'm in a white majority space. There are no people of color that are, right, like in space. So how, first, there's some people question, is there even a value in even having a conversation if
Hmm.
we're not going to be in company with other folks, right? And then there are other conversations would say, how do we even do this? We don't even understand how to navigate these things. And so I think it's important. What you lift up is really important, and I want to speak on that, is that we don't have to have someone who is right in front of us and in our midst to be able to learn, especially
Right.
today in 2024. Here we are again, social media and access to news, that there's really important, there's opportunities to be able to have these conversations about what's happening, and the racial crises that are happening in our nation and around the world, even in the absence of people. And I say this because here I'm going to allude back to these protests that are happening on these college campuses right now. And there are people that may not ever, ever, ever meet someone who lived in Gaza.
Hmm.
And
That's
yet
right.
here we are, right? Like, so,
That's
so
right.
here we are. There is an opportunity because we do not need to. Here's another soundbite is we assume that we can only have relationship when there's an affinity in experience,
Hmm.
but there can be affinity in emotion,
Yeah.
right? Like we can all tap into the emotion of fear, right? Like just fear. If we're sticking with these protests, people that are on these campuses are can tap into the fear that our siblings, our Palestinian and our Israeli siblings are navigating, and can tap into that. Just because we ourselves have not navigated some of the aspects of what's happening in that war doesn't mean that we cannot connect in these ways. And so I say the same thing in these rural communities. It's irrelevant, even if you don't have people of color that are in your congregation or community. It doesn't mean that there is not some responsibility that's needed to be able to equip, because it doesn't mean that people that are in your congregation are not going to be connecting in the future with people. But also, if we're talking about the future leaders of tomorrow, we have a responsibility to address it. And we can, even by connecting with these emotions, right? These are
Yep.
things that we can identify with and move the needle forward.
Yeah. Yeah. That's really salient. And thank you for that. It occurs to me too, something I said in my predominantly white church is it's actually important for white folks to do this work together and to at least have these preliminary conversations almost in a silo, because there can be deep damage that could be done if it was a racially mixed group without some really initial, I mean, I'm talking kind of base level stuff, but there's pain there, and there are things that intent not being the same as impact. I don't think anyone intentionally tries to harm in at least some of the groups I'm involved in, I hope and pray. But there is a lot of unintentional traps that we can fall into, and some messiness there that needs to be unpacked a bit actually before coming to a higher level of engagement and mutuality. So anyway,
Yeah.
that's from my background and angle. But yeah, it's
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
work, engaging in it wherever one finds oneself is hugely important. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think that we also, you know, really reduce the conversation about racism when we just kind of when we stick to just this piece,
Mm,
right? So like which what you just shared kind of triggered this notion for me, right? Is like, you know, so many times when it comes to Martin Luther King, right? You know, think about January 15th and all the pictures that come, or Black History Month comes, and we get
yeah.
ready for all the pictures that come, and it's showing all these people, and one of my quote unquote favorite pictures of MLK is him walking hand in hand, and there's like it's like a painting, right? And he's like smiling as he's walking hand in hand and he's protesting. And I remember laughing, saying, "I doubt that that Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was excited to go protest. Like, I doubt that on Bloody Sunday he was like, 'Let me leave my children. I'm so excited to do this so that I can go and walk into this space where people are going to be brutally beaten,' right? Like, I doubt that's the case. And yet, anytime we're in these spaces where we want to have a conversation about racism, and it's in a, as you're saying, kind of there is this kind of a racially mixed diversity that's in this space. People who are, you know, people of color then tend to be one, reduced to only talking about these conversations, right? So like when people come to me, they'll assume that that's my joy, is to only talk about the struggles
Yeah.
that I have. And I say to people, hey, Black people swim. Black
That's
people will go, like, you know,
right.
so
That's
so
right.
part of relationship building is widening this so that we're not reducing
Yeah.
people's existence to the struggles that they endure, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
That's right.
that's you know that's a really big challenge that I think that we have, and not an intentional, right? I mean, even not intentional, but
Yep.
uh just kind of the way that we move forward, it tends to be this way. But see, racism is not a formulaic equation, right? Like it's not something that we can just tap into, and that's that task-based stuff, and check
Yeah.
the box and move forward. Like it affects the entire person. It
Yeah.
affects if I swim, it
Yep.
affects where I golf, right? Like, so it doesn't, so I mean, so part of relationship is widening this so that trust can be gained,
Yeah.
so that we
Yeah.
can have that. But when we don't have that, and we kind of have these diverse spaces for the conversation, well then I end up my learning, because even as a person of color I need to learn about race and racism, I need to learn about this, but my learning gets hijacked because I become expected to become the educator
That's
instead
the
of the
expert.
participant, right?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
I then have to speak to all of these things, and it burdens even, and here we are, intent versus impact, right? It's irrelevant about what our intention was. The impact is that I'm not, then my value is limited, right?
That's
Only
right.
to what I can give to the people that are hungry for the news.
Hmm.
And so that's why I call it pig on a skewer, is this idea that there are people that are hungry, that are eating and pulling,
Hmm.
and leaving just these spaces. So I do think that affinity groups are needed for the conversation. I do think that people of color, that's also a misnomer. The people of color think that because we already understand oppression, we don't need to learn, but we do need to learn about our siblings of different backgrounds as well as our own history. So we do
Yeah.
need to have affinity spaces, but the conversation definitely needs to be had.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and we've been talking about relationship, right? And part of relationship involves trust, and it also involves vulnerability. So a willingness to say, "Hey, you're my friend. This isn't right. Like this didn't land well, right?" Or, "Yeah, you may have intended this, but the impact was this." I remember having a conversation in one of these spaces a couple of years ago where I was interviewing a black man, and I was asking him because of his profession, but I was asking him about the work that was that made um, black folks coming out harder, and was talking about, can you name, and this was his realm of expertise, but I say, can you name why this might be more difficult? And he said, yes, I'll do that, but let me also name the joy of it. And I was like, oh, Thank you, because and very
Mm.
graciously, but was able to sort of put me on a bit of a course correction to say, yes, there is hardship, but also let's talk about how incredibly joyful this is and what the experience, the whole experience of this is, right? The whole life that I was trying to pigeonhole into one sort of smaller area. And being able to sort of receive those kinds of things is part of relationship, anybody's relationship, and it's so important.